How to keep praying when heaven feels closed. So you do not lose hope. There is a kind of suffering that does not make noise in public, but it can shake a soul more deeply than the storms everyone else can see. It is not always the suffering of tragedy, loss, or open disaster. Sometimes it is the suffering of silence. It is the pain of praying with sincerity and hearing nothing back. It is the ache of seeking God with a heart that still believes He is real, still believes He is good, still believes He is able, and yet feels surrounded by a silence so heavy that it begins to press against every thought, every prayer, and every fragile piece of hope left inside. That is what makes this battle so difficult to explain. You are not running from God. You are reaching for Him. You are not resisting prayer. You are trying to stay faithful in it. But instead of relief, there is stillness. Instead of clarity, there is fog. Instead of comfort, there is the growing fear that maybe heaven has closed over your life. This is where many believers begin to break in ways no one around them notices. They still show up. They still function. They still know how to say the words that make them sound strong. But under the surface, something has started to fracture. Prayer becomes harder to carry. Hope becomes harder to protect. The heart becomes more careful with expectation because disappointment has visited too many times. At first, the person tells himself this is just a passing season. Then days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, and the silence begins to shape the inner world. The questions get sharper. The weariness gets deeper. The soul starts asking things it once would have been afraid to say out loud. Is God listening? Has something changed between us? Why does it feel like I am pouring out my heart into a closed sky? Why do I still believe yet feel so alone in this? That is why this message matters. Because the greatest danger in a silent season is not only the pain of waiting, it is the meaning your heart assigns to the waiting. Silence can become a breeding ground for false conclusions. It can persuade a wounded mind that delay means rejection, that stillness means absence, that unanswered prayer means unnoticed pain. And if those lies settle in, hope does not usually die in one dramatic moment. It fades quietly. It weakens little by little. It loses strength while a person still looks faithful on the outside. So we are not going to treat this lightly. We are not going to cover deep spiritual exhaustion with shallow encouragement. We are going to walk straight into one of the hardest realities of the Christian life and face it honestly. Because there are seasons when faith is not tested by what is happening around you, but by what seems missing above you. There are moments when the greatest trial is not whether you can pray once with passion, but whether you can keep praying when the silence makes your heart feel tired, confused, and dangerously close to giving up. And if that is where you are right now, this message is for you. Because what feels like the collapse of hope may actually be the place where God teaches you how to trust Him more deeply than feelings, more steadily than circumstances, and more honestly than ever before. When silence becomes the real test of faith, most people imagine that faith is tested only by obvious pain. They think of faith being tested when life falls apart in visible ways, when a relationship breaks, when a diagnosis changes everything, when money disappears, when betrayal cuts deep, or when a door slams shut in front of a dream that once felt certain. Those are real tests, and no honest believer should pretend otherwise. But there is another test that can cut even deeper, because it is harder to define, harder to explain, and harder to endure over time. It is the test of silence. It is the test of bringing your heart before God again and again, only to feel as if nothing is moving, nothing is opening, and nothing is coming back. It is the test of lifting up a burden that is still there tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. It is the test of remaining in prayer when prayer itself starts to feel like a place where your own voice is the only sound you hear. This is where faith stops sounding poetic and starts becoming costly. It is easy to say you trust God when you can clearly connect the prayer to the answer. It is much easier to feel spiritual when there is evidence that heaven is responding in ways your emotions can quickly recognize. But when the answer is delayed, when the direction is unclear, when the pain is ongoing, and when the silence lingers longer than you ever expected, faith is forced into a deeper form. It becomes less about what you feel in the moment and more about what you choose to hold on to when the moment gives you nothing to hold. That is why silence is such a real and severe test. It strips away spiritual performance. It exposes whether your relationship with God has been built only on visible response or whether it can survive in a season where confidence must stand without immediate reinforcement. Silence is so painful because it touches the place of relationship. When suffering is visible, at least the mind can identify the problem. But when the ache comes from feeling unheard by the God you trust, the wound enters a more intimate part of the soul. You do not only ask what is happening, you start asking what this means. Did I do something wrong? Is God displeased with me? Did I miss him somewhere? Is this silence correction, distance, or abandonment? Why does it seem like other people testify about breakthroughs while I am still carrying the same prayer in the same tired hands? Those questions do not make a person weak. They reveal how personal this struggle becomes. The believer is not merely wrestling with circumstances. The believer is wrestling with interpretation. When heaven feels quiet, the human heart begins searching for an explanation. And if truth is not guiding that search, pain will gladly write its own story. That is why silence becomes the real test of faith. It does not only challenge your patience, it challenges your image of God. It asks whether you still trust his heart when you cannot understand his timing. It asks whether you still believe he is near when your emotions argue the opposite. It asks whether your prayer life depends on constant reassurance or whether it can remain alive in the dark. And this is where many sincere people begin to drift, not because they hate God, but because disappointment slowly weakens their expectation. They still pray, but with less confidence. They still seek, but with less openness. They still speak to God, but now there is caution in the heart because repeated silence has taught them to protect themselves from fresh disappointment. Scripture does not hide this reality. David did not pray like a man untouched by divine silence. In the book of Psalms, he cries out from places of confusion, urgency, and emotional strain. He asks, "How long?" He pleads for God to hear him. He brings God the full weight of his anguish rather than pretending faith means emotional numbness. That matters, because it reminds us that deep faith does not mean a person never struggles with silence. It means the struggle itself is brought into the presence of God. David did not prove his faith by having no questions. He proved it by directing those questions toward God instead of letting them push him away. That is a vital difference. A silent season can either become the place where a believer withdraws in quiet resentment, or the place where the believer learns to cling to God more honestly than ever before. And that honesty matters, because silence reveals what quick answers often conceal. It reveals whether you were loving God only for results or whether you were willing to remain with him when the results were delayed. It reveals whether prayer was only a transaction to get relief or whether prayer was also a place of surrender, dependence, and trust. It reveals whether hope in your life was built on timing you could control or on a God whose wisdom is deeper than your immediate understanding. That revelation can be painful, but it can also become holy. Because the silence that seems to threaten faith can also purify it. It can remove illusion. It can expose self-protection. It can teach the soul to stand on something stronger than emotion. So the real question in this season is not only whether God will answer. The deeper question is what this silence is uncovering inside you while you wait. Because if you misunderstand this test, you will assume the main danger is the delay itself. But often the greater danger is what the delay starts producing in the inner life. The silence begins to wear down the heart. The prayer that once felt alive starts feeling heavy. The fire that once came naturally begins to weaken. And that is where the next chapter begins, because after silence tests faith, it starts affecting the experience of prayer itself. The moment prayer stops feeling alive. There is a moment in a long season of silence that many believers do not know how to describe. Nothing dramatic happens on the outside. There is no announcement, no visible collapse, no sudden decision to stop praying. Everything looks normal from a distance. The person still bows the head, still tries to find the words, still enters the place of prayer. But inside, something has shifted. Prayer no longer feels alive. What once felt like connection now feels like effort. What once carried warmth now feels cold. What once rose from the heart with conviction now feels like it is being dragged upward by habit alone. This is one of the most dangerous moments in the spiritual life because it is the place where many people keep the appearance of faith while quietly losing the inner strength that made prayer real to them. At first, the change can seem small. You notice that it takes more energy to begin. You hesitate before praying because you already expect the same silence. You repeat familiar phrases, but they no longer feel full. You ask for the same things, but now the words seem thinner than they used to be. It is not that you no longer believe in God. It is that the gap between your faith and your experience has grown so wide that every prayer now has to cross a field of disappointment before it even leaves your mouth. That is exhausting. And the longer that exhaustion remains unspoken, the more it starts reshaping the way you approach God. This is where prayer can become mechanical. The mouth continues, but the heart lags behind. The routine survives, but the expectation weakens. A person can be physically present in prayer while emotionally withdrawing from it at the same time. That is the hidden tragedy of this season. You are not openly rejecting God. You are simply struggling to keep your soul engaged in a place that has become associated with pain, waiting, and unanswered longing. The heart remembers disappointment. It starts protecting itself. It starts lowering expectation before prayer even begins. And when expectation drops, prayer starts to lose its sense of movement. It begins to feel like a duty performed in a locked room. This is why spiritual dryness can be more serious than many people realize. Dryness is not just the absence of emotion. It is the growing temptation to separate prayer from hope. It is the quiet training of the soul to speak to God without really expecting anything to happen. That is where something sacred begins to decay. Because prayer was never meant to be a ritual of managed disappointment. It was meant to be the expression of dependence, trust, surrender, and living relationship. When that relationship starts feeling distant for too long, the person praying often begins to adapt in unhealthy ways. Some become formal and detached. Some become rushed and distracted. Some begin shortening prayer not because they have learned simplicity, but because they no longer have the emotional strength to stay in the silence. Some keep talking, But inside, they have already begun grieving the prayer life they used to have. And this part matters deeply because many believers feel ashamed when they reach this point. They think something must be wrong with them because prayer no longer feels vibrant. They assume that if they were more spiritual, more disciplined, or more full of faith, they would always feel the same fire. But that is not how the inner life works. There are seasons when the struggle is not a lack of love for God. It is the fatigue of carrying unresolved pain into prayer over and over again. The soul gets tired. The mind gets crowded. The emotions become hesitant. A person can deeply love God and still feel numb in prayer after a long season of silence. That numbness can be frightening. Not because it means God is left, but because it makes the believer feel unfamiliar to himself. You remember how you used to pray. You remember the tears, the urgency, the nearness, the sense that heaven was open. Now you kneel down and feel resistance where there used to be flow. You try to reach for language that once came naturally, and now every sentence feels heavy. You wonder what happened. You wonder if you changed. You wonder if the silence has done more damage than you wanted to admit. And in that moment, a dangerous thought often appears. Maybe I am losing my ability to pray. But that is not always what is happening. Sometimes you are not losing your prayer life. Sometimes your prayer life is being stripped of everything that once depended on emotional momentum. Sometimes God allows a season where the outward feeling of prayer weakens so that a deeper form of faith can emerge. Not a faith built on immediate spiritual sensation, but a faith that keeps turning toward God even when the emotional reward is gone. That does not make the season easy. It makes it revealing. It exposes how much of your consistency depended on what prayer gave you back in the moment. And when that familiar return is removed, the soul is forced to confront a harder question. Will I still come to God when all I seem to receive is silence? This is where many people are standing right now. They have not abandoned prayer, but prayer does not feel alive the way it once did. Their words are still reaching upward, but their heart is carrying a weight that makes every sentence harder to release. And that weight must be understood because when prayer starts feeling lifeless, the mind often begins interpreting the silence in personal ways. The heart starts drawing conclusions about what God's quietness means. It starts labeling silence as rejection, distance, or displeasure. And that is where the next battle begins, because once prayer stops feeling alive, the wounded heart becomes vulnerable to misreading God Himself. How the heart misreads God in quiet seasons. One of the most dangerous things about a silent season is not only the pain it causes, it is the story the heart begins to tell itself while the silence continues. When answers do not come, when prayer feels heavy, when the days keep passing without clarity, the human heart rarely remains empty. It starts interpreting. It starts filling the silence with meaning. And if that meaning is not shaped by truth, it will almost always be shaped by pain. That is why quiet seasons can become so spiritually confusing. The issue is no longer just that God feels silent. The issue becomes what the silence seems to say. This is where many sincere believers begin to misread God. Not because they are rebellious, not because they want to resist Him, but because pain has a way of bending perception when it goes on for too long. A wounded heart starts connecting silence with rejection. It starts assuming that the lack of visible response must mean something is wrong in the relationship. Maybe God is displeased. Maybe He has stepped back. Maybe this prayer no longer matters to Him. Maybe heaven has moved on while you are still kneeling in the same place, carrying the same burden, asking the same question. Those thoughts can settle in quietly, and when they do, they begin changing the entire spiritual atmosphere of a person's inner life. The heart in pain does not usually choose its conclusions carefully. It reacts. It protects. It searches for a reason that can explain the ache. That is why the silence of God can feel so personal. If the trial were only external, the believer could focus on the circumstance. But when the trial feels tied to God's apparent quietness, the mind starts looking upward for the explanation. And this is where discernment becomes vulnerable. Instead of saying, "I do not understand what God is doing," the soul begins saying, "I know what this means." That shift is subtle, but it is powerful. Not understanding is painful, but it still leaves room for trust. Assuming the worst about God begins closing that room. This happens more often than many people realize. A person prays for healing and the body remains weak. The heart begins to wonder if God is withholding mercy. A person prays for direction and receives no clarity. The mind starts assuming God does not want to lead. A person prays for relief in a crushing emotional season, and the burden still lingers. The wounded soul starts suggesting that maybe God sees the pain and is choosing not to respond. Those interpretations may feel honest, but feeling honest is not the same as being true. In quiet seasons, emotions can become loud witnesses, but they are not always trustworthy interpreters. That is why the heart must be guarded in silence. Because if silence is not understood correctly, it begins changing how a person sees the character of God. The believer may still call him good with the mouth, but inside, the picture has begun to distort. God starts seeming less tender, less near, less attentive, less willing. The person does not usually announce this shift. It happens beneath the surface. Prayer becomes more hesitant. Worship becomes more restrained. Hope becomes more cautious. The soul no longer approaches God with open trust, but with guarded uncertainty. And once that distortion takes root, the problem is no longer only the pain of waiting. The problem becomes that the waiting has started rewriting the believer's image of God. Scripture shows us that this inner struggle is not new. Think about the cry of David in the book of Psalms. He did not hide the confusion that comes when God seems distant. He asked why God felt far off in times of trouble. He cried out, asking how long the silence would continue. But David's strength was not that he never felt those questions. His strength was that he brought them into prayer instead of turning them into final conclusions. He felt the tension, but he did not let the tension become doctrine. He experienced silence, but he refused to let silence define the nature of God. That is an essential lesson for any believer walking through quiet seasons. Your pain may be real, but pain does not have the authority to define who God is. This is where many people lose ground without realizing it. They do not walk away from God in one open act of rebellion. They slowly start relating to Him through disappointment. They begin measuring His love by the speed of His answers. They begin measuring His nearness by the intensity of their feelings. They begin measuring His faithfulness by whether circumstances change when they want them to. And when those measurements fail, the heart starts drawing dark conclusions. But God was never meant to be interpreted by wounded emotion alone. He must be known by truth, remembered through Scripture, and trusted even when the season is too heavy for feelings to speak clearly. The problem is that silence puts pressure on memory. When heaven feels quiet, it becomes harder to remember what is still true. The soul becomes consumed with what is missing right now. Clarity is missing. Relief is missing. The answer is missing. The visible sign is missing. And because the mind becomes so focused on what is absent, it can forget everything God has already revealed about himself. It can forget that he is patient, wise, near to the brokenhearted, and faithful beyond human timing. It can forget that many of his deepest works happen in hidden places long before they become visible in outward form. Quiet seasons do not erase those truths, but they can make them harder to feel. That is why faith in silence must become an act of remembering, not merely an act of feeling. And this is where the spiritual battle intensifies, because once the heart misreads God, it begins building assumptions to explain the silence. The soul starts constructing its own explanations for what heaven has not yet clarified. That is the next danger. Not only pain, not only confusion, but assumption. An assumption, if left unchallenged, can quietly become one of the greatest enemies of hope. The hidden war between hope and assumption. There is a battle that begins after silence has lasted long enough to wound the heart and cloud the mind. It is not always the obvious battle between faith and doubt. Many believers expect that battle. They know what it feels like to resist fear, to reject unbelief, to keep standing when the pressure is visible. But there is a more hidden war that often goes unnoticed, and in many quiet seasons it becomes even more dangerous. It is the war between hope and assumption. Hope waits with open hands. Assumption fills those hands with explanations God never gave. Hope leaves room for God to act in ways the heart does not yet understand. Assumption rushes to define the silence, interpret the delay, and explain the pain before truth has fully spoken. This is how the mind often reacts when prayer remains unanswered. It does not like uncertainty. It does not like unfinished tension. It does not like standing in mystery without control, so it begins to create reasons. Maybe this will never change. Maybe God already said no and I just do not want to accept it. Maybe the silence means I am being passed over. Maybe the prayer is no longer worth praying. Maybe this burden will be with me for the rest of my life. Maybe nothing is happening at all. These thoughts can sound reasonable when a person is exhausted, but many of them are not discernment. They are assumptions shaped by pain, fatigue, and the deep human need to make sense of suffering. That is why this hidden war is so serious. Doubt often arrives like an intruder, and because it is easy to recognize, a believer knows to resist it. Assumption is more subtle. It often sounds calm, logical, even mature. It can disguise itself as realism. It can present itself as emotional self-protection. It can sound like wisdom when in fact it is wounded interpretation trying to gain control over an unresolved season. And when a believer starts living from assumptions instead of truth, hope begins losing oxygen. Not because God has become less faithful, but because the inner room where expectation once lived has slowly been filled with conclusions that leave no space for surprise, mercy, or divine timing. This is what makes assumption so spiritually costly. It does not always tell you to stop praying. Sometimes it tells you to keep praying without expectation. It does not always tell you to walk away from God. Sometimes it tells you to stay near Him, but with guarded distance in the heart. It does not always announce itself as unbelief. Sometimes it hides behind phrases like, I am just being honest, or I do not want to get my hopes up anymore. And while honesty matters, there is a difference between honest pain and false certainty. Honest pain says, I do not understand what God is doing. False certainty says, I already know He will not move. Honest pain still leaves room for trust. Assumption quietly closes that room. The mind in a silent season can become very persuasive. It takes real disappointments and uses them to build final interpretations. It remembers the last delay, the last prayer that seemed unanswered, the last moment when hope rose and nothing changed. Then it uses that history to write a future God has not yet written. That is one of the cruelest effects of prolonged silence. It tempts a believer to treat past pain like prophecy. Because it hurt before, the mind assumes it will hurt the same way again. Because the answer did not come when expected, the heart begins assuming there is no answer coming at all. Because the heavens felt closed for a long time, the soul starts assuming they will remain closed indefinitely. But assumption is a poor guide in spiritual life because it is often built on limited vision, trying to interpret a God whose work is not always visible in the middle of the process. Scripture repeatedly shows that human beings are weak interpreters of unfinished seasons. Think of Hannah in the first book of Samuel. Her grief had gone on so long that her anguish became part of her daily existence. She was misunderstood by people around her, burdened by sorrow, and carrying a prayer she could not resolve by effort. If someone had looked only at the visible timeline, assumption would have written a hopeless story over her life. But God was not absent from the silence. He was not indifferent to the tears. The visible delay was not the full truth. That is, the lesson assumption resists. Assumption judges the entire story from the middle of the chapter. Hope refuses to do that. This hidden war affects prayer more than many people realize. Once assumption settles into the heart, prayer changes. It becomes smaller, weaker, less open. A person may still speak to God, but now the soul is negotiating with disappointment before every prayer is formed. The person starts bracing inwardly, expecting silence in advance, preparing emotionally for nothing to happen. That self-protection feels understandable, but it gradually trains the heart to live without expectation. And when expectation weakens for too long, hope begins starving. Not because hope needs constant emotional excitement, but because hope does need room. It needs the freedom to say, I do not understand this season, but I refuse to decide God's intentions for him. That kind of resistance is deeply spiritual. It is not denial. It is not pretending everything is fine. It is not forcing shallow positivity onto a heavy situation. It is the disciplined refusal to let pain become your prophet. It is the decision to leave certain questions open before God rather than closing them with wounded logic. It is the wisdom of saying, I know what I feel, but I do not know everything God is doing. I know the silence is real, but I do not know that silence means abandonment. I know this delay is painful, but I do not know that delay means denial. That posture protects hope because it keeps the soul from speaking final words where God has not yet finished speaking. And this matters because once assumption loses its grip, something else can begin to emerge from the ruins of exhaustion. The believer can stop performing polished spirituality and start bringing raw truth to God. The heart can stop trying to sound impressive in prayer and start becoming real. That is where the next turn happens. Because when silence has stripped away illusion and when assumption is exposed for what it is, desperation itself can become a sacred place. Why desperation can become a sacred place? There comes a point in a long season of silence when a person no longer has the strength to sound polished before God. The phrases that once came easily feel too clean for the pain being carried. The composed language that once made prayer feel ordered and strong begins to feel distant from what is actually happening inside. The heart becomes too burdened to perform, too tired to decorate the struggle, too honest to keep pretending that everything is still being carried with calm confidence. And that moment, though many believers fear it, can become one of the holiest moments in the entire spiritual life. Because desperation, when brought into the presence of God instead of hidden behind religious language, can become sacred ground. Many people have been taught to see desperation only as weakness. They hear the word and think of instability, emotional collapse, spiritual failure, or loss of control. But desperation is not always the enemy. Sometimes desperation is what remains after pride has been broken, self-reliance has been exposed, and every illusion of control has been stripped away. Sometimes desperation is the soul standing before God without decoration, without strategy, without image management, without the need to impress. It is what happens when a person no longer has the energy to pretend faith is easy, and instead comes to God with the kind of honesty that only pain can produce. That kind of honesty matters deeply. Because there are seasons when polished prayer can hide the heart instead of revealing it. A person can say all the right things and still remain guarded before God. A person can sound reverent, stable, and spiritually mature while secretly keeping the deepest ache protected from exposure. But desperation breaks that barrier. It forces the inner life into the open. It pushes the believer to speak from the wound instead of around it. And in that place, prayer changes. It becomes less about saying beautiful things and more about refusing to leave God's presence even when all you have left is need. This is one of the great paradoxes of the spiritual life. The place that feels like collapse can become the place of truest communion. Not because pain itself is holy, but because pain can strip away everything false. In desperation, the believer stops trying to manage how the prayer sounds and starts offering what is actually there. Fear is there. Weariness is there. Confusion is there. Tears are there. Questions are there. Longing is there. And when all of that is placed before God without disguise, something real begins to happen. The relationship becomes more honest. The dependence becomes more complete. The soul stops standing before God as a performer and starts standing before Him as a child who knows there is nowhere else to go. Scripture gives powerful witness to this kind of sacred desperation. Think of Hannah in the first book of Samuel. Her prayer did not come from a place of calm order. It came from deep anguish, from prolonged sorrow, from a heart that had carried pain long enough to be undone by it. She poured herself out before the Lord. She was not presenting a polished version of suffering. She was bringing the suffering itself. And that matters because it shows that God is not repelled by the rawness of a desperate soul. He does not require His people to become emotionally neat before they come near. He invites truth. He receives brokenness honestly offered. He sees what religious performance often hides. The same pattern appears again in moments throughout Scripture where the most powerful encounters with God do not happen through smooth presentation, but through desperate dependence. A desperate father cries out for help for his child. A desperate blind man keeps calling out even when others try to silence him. A desperate woman reaches through the crowd because she believes that even one touch matters. These moments are not celebrated because the people involved looked dignified. They are remembered because desperation drove them past image and into pursuit. They came needy. They came exposed. They came without control. And it was precisely there that faith became visible in its truest form. That is important for the believer walking through silence now. You may feel that your desperation is evidence that something is wrong with you. You may feel embarrassed by how weak your prayers sound, how broken your thoughts feel, how little strength you have left to sustain the version of yourself you once presented to God. But the sacredness of desperation is this: it removes the false distance between your actual condition and your prayer life. It teaches you to bring the real wound. It teaches you to stop offering edited versions of your soul. It teaches you that God is not waiting for a cleaned up performance. He is waiting for truth in the inward parts. And once a person learns that, prayer begins to change in a profound way. It becomes less polished, but more real, less structured, but more surrendered, less driven by image, but more filled with dependence. In that place, there is no energy left for pretending strength you do not have. There is only enough strength to stay near, to say, "Help me," to say, "I am tired," to say, "I do not understand," to say, "Do not let me go." Those are not inferior prayers. In many seasons, they are the truest prayers a human soul can offer. This is why desperation can become sacred, because it reveals that prayer was never meant to be sustained by appearance. It was meant to be sustained by need, trust, surrender, and relationship. And when desperation strips away every artificial support, it leaves behind the one question that matters most. Will I still turn toward God when I have nothing impressive left to offer Him? That question leads directly into the next chapter, because once prayer is stripped of polish and reduced to simple dependence, the believer must learn how to continue praying without the support of strong emotion. That is where a deeper endurance begins to form. The prayer life that survives without feelings. One of the hardest lessons in the spiritual life is learning that prayer cannot always be carried by emotion. There are seasons when the heart feels full, when the words come naturally, when the presence of God feels near, and when prayer seems to rise with warmth, clarity, and strength. In those moments, many believers feel confident in their spiritual consistency because prayer feels alive to them. But there are other seasons, darker and more demanding, when the feelings that once supported prayer seem to disappear. The warmth is gone. The urgency is weaker. The sweetness is absent. The emotional reward that once made it easier to remain in prayer no longer arrives. And that is where a deeper kind of spiritual formation begins, because the believer is forced to answer a painful question. If strong feelings are removed, what will keep my prayer life standing? This question matters because many people do not realize how much of their prayer rhythm was connected to inner sensation. They thought they were being sustained by pure devotion, but often devotion had been helped by felt comfort, visible movement, emotional release, or the sense that heaven was close in a way they could easily perceive. There is nothing wrong with those moments. They are gifts. But when a season of silence comes, and those gifts seem to pull back, the soul discovers whether it has learned how to remain with God in a more stripped-down way. This is where prayer stops being sustained by emotional flow and starts being sustained by decision, reverence, memory, and trust. That shift can feel brutal at first. A person enters prayer and finds no inner momentum. There is no sense of sweetness carrying the heart forward. There is no strong wave of conviction pushing the words into depth. There is only weakness, routine, and the stubborn choice to stay present before God. And because modern spiritual language often places so much weight on what a person feels, many believers become discouraged here. They assume something is deeply wrong because prayer feels dry. They conclude that the absence of emotion must mean the absence of God. But those two things are not the same. The lack of felt comfort is not proof of divine distance. Many times it is the place where God is training the soul to remain anchored in truth instead of depending on sensation as the main evidence of his nearness. This kind of prayer life is easy to admire from a distance and very difficult to live from the inside. It is one thing to speak beautifully about faithfulness in hard seasons. It is another thing entirely to kneel in a quiet room with a tired mind, a disappointed heart, and no emotional lift, and still choose to stay there before God. That is not weak prayer. That is mature prayer in formation. It may feel less impressive, but it is often more costly, more honest, and more enduring than the kind of prayer that rises quickly on the strength of feeling. The soul is learning to say, I will come to God not only when prayer feels rewarding, but because He is still God and I still belong near Him. This is where many people need correction and comfort at the same time. Correction, because they must stop treating feelings like the ruler of spiritual reality. Comfort, because they need to know they are not failing simply because prayer no longer feels powerful in the same way it once did. A season without emotional reinforcement does not mean faith is dying. Sometimes it means faith is being purified. It means the believer is being led into a more stable form of devotion, one that can survive the absence of immediate emotional feedback. That kind of devotion is quieter, but it is strong. It is less dramatic, but often more durable. It is the kind of prayer life that stays when many of the usual supports have been removed. The book of Psalms helps here in a profound way because it teaches believers that prayer is not reserved for emotionally elevated moments. David prayed in confidence, but he also prayed in sorrow, confusion, weakness, fear, and exhaustion. He did not wait until his emotions were resolved before turning toward God. He turned toward God while carrying emotions that were unresolved. That is one of the clearest biblical lessons about enduring prayer. You do not need to feel spiritually strong to pray faithfully. You need to remain willing to come honestly. Faithfulness is not proven by emotional intensity. Faithfulness is proven by returning, by remaining, by refusing to let the absence of feeling become the end of prayer. There is also something deeply humbling in this season, because praying without feelings removes many hidden dependencies. It exposes how much the soul enjoyed emotional reassurance. It reveals how quickly a person can begin to doubt when the experience of comfort fades. It shows where spiritual habits were rooted more in what was received than in who God is. That exposure can feel unsettling, but it is not meaningless. God is not only interested in giving His people moments of spiritual sweetness. He is also committed to forming in them a steadier obedience, a deeper surrender, and a more rooted love. A prayer life that survives without feelings becomes less fragile. It no longer collapses every time the emotional weather changes. It learns how to keep breathing in dry places. This does not mean emotion is unimportant. It means emotion cannot be the foundation. Feelings rise and fall. Some days the heart is full, and some days it is tired. Some days prayer feels immediate, and some days it feels slow. Some days the soul senses comfort clearly, and some days it walks by memory more than sensation. But the God being approached in prayer has not changed just because the inner atmosphere has changed. That is the truth this season forces into the deepest parts of the believer. God is still worthy when prayer feels heavy. God is still near when the room feels quiet. God is still listening when the heart feels numb. God is still forming something in the hidden life, even when no emotional signal confirms it in the moment. And once a believer begins learning that, another question begins to rise. If feelings are no longer carrying the prayer life, then what is God doing in the hidden places while everything seems unchanged? What is being built beneath the surface when the outward situation looks the same, the silence still lingers, and the soul keeps waiting? That is where the next chapter leads, because the unseen work of God often becomes clearest only after the believer has learned how to remain before Him without the support of strong feelings. What God may be forming while nothing seems to change. One of the deepest frustrations in a season of silence is the feeling that everything is standing still. You pray, but the situation looks the same. You seek God, but the burden is still there. You wait, but the answer does not arrive in the form you hoped for. Day after day, the outward picture appears unchanged, and because the outward picture remains so stubbornly familiar, the heart can begin to assume that nothing meaningful is happening at all. That assumption is one of the quietest dangers in the waiting life. Human beings naturally look for visible movement. We want signs, shifts, confirmation, direction, and relief. We want to point to something concrete and say, now I know this is changing. But much of God's work in a believer's life happens beneath the level of immediate visibility. It happens where the eye cannot measure it yet, where emotion cannot fully confirm it yet, and where the soul is being reshaped in ways that will only make sense later. This is why silence can feel so misleading. It gives the impression of inactivity when, in reality, hidden formation may already be taking place. The person praying often measures progress by external developments. Has the door open? Has the pain lifted? Has the answer come? Has the timeline moved? Those questions are understandable, but they are not the only questions that matter. A more searching question is this: what is becoming different in me while I wait? Because even when circumstances remain painfully stable, the inner life may be undergoing a profound transformation. Endurance may be strengthening. Self-reliance may be weakening. Motives may be becoming cleaner. The need for control may be losing its grip. The soul may be learning to cling to God with greater honesty, greater humility, and greater stability than before. None of that is easy to celebrate when the visible burden has not changed, but it is real, and it matters more than many people realize. One of the hardest things to accept is that God can be working deeply without working quickly in the way we expected. He can be active in hidden formation while the outward answer is still delayed. That truth offends the impatient part of us because we often want relief more than refinement. We want the situation solved, the weight lifted, the tension ended. But God's purposes in a season of silence are often larger than immediate comfort. He is not indifferent to relief, but He is also not limited to giving only what ends pain fast. Sometimes He is building something in the inner architecture of a person's life that cannot be formed in easier seasons. Patience that costs nothing is shallow. Trust that has never been stretched remains untested. Surrender that never had to release control remains mostly theoretical. It is often in hidden seasons, when the answer isn't visible and the soul cannot force movement, that these deeper qualities are formed with lasting strength. The book of James speaks about the testing of faith producing endurance, and that truth becomes intensely personal in a waiting season. Endurance is not formed in moments where everything happens on demand. It is formed when a believer must continue standing, continue trusting, continue returning to God, even while carrying tension that has not yet been resolved. Endurance is not glamorous. It is slow. It is repetitive. It often feels unnoticed, but it changes a person. It develops a steadiness that easier seasons cannot produce. The believer begins to realize that spiritual strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet ability to keep turning toward God without visible reinforcement, to keep obeying without immediate clarity, and to keep refusing despair even when the road remains long. Hidden formation also purifies motives in ways that success rarely does. When prayer is answered quickly, the heart does not always realize how much of its peace was tied to control, how much of its confidence was tied to results, and how much of its devotion was tied to visible reassurance. But in a prolonged, silent season, those layers begin to surface. A person starts seeing how badly the soul wanted certainty, how strongly it depended on outcomes, how often it equated God's goodness with immediate relief. That exposure can feel painful, even humiliating, but it is a mercy. God is not uncovering those things to shame His people. He is uncovering them so they can be surrendered. Hidden formation often begins with hidden exposure. What is unstable must be revealed before it can be healed. What is too attached to control must be confronted before true surrender can grow. There is also a tenderness in this hidden work that many people miss because they are so focused on the unanswered prayer itself. God may be teaching a person how to remain near Him without needing constant emotional assurance. He may be teaching the soul how to distinguish between His silence and His absence. He may be teaching a deeper kind of dependence, one that no longer approaches prayer only to get a result, but because being near Him has become the place of survival. That is not a small transformation. It is one of the most profound changes a believer can undergo. The relationship with God becomes less transactional and more rooted. The person begins to understand that while answers matter, what is being formed in the waiting may shape the rest of life more deeply than the answer itself. Think of Joseph in the book of Genesis. Long before the visible fulfillment came, there were hidden years where the story appeared delayed, interrupted, even unfair. If someone had judged God's faithfulness only by the outward timeline, they would have reached dark and incomplete conclusions. But the hidden years were not empty years. Character was being formed. Wisdom was being deepened. Preparation was unfolding in places no one could yet see. That pattern appears throughout Scripture because God is never confined to the pace of human expectation. He can be profoundly active in seasons that feel painfully still. This does not erase the ache of waiting. It does not make silence easy. It does not mean every question is instantly resolved by understanding that God may be forming something hidden. But it does protect the heart from one destructive lie, the lie that nothing is happening. Something may be happening in the roots while the branches still look bare. Something may be strengthening in the soul while the circumstances still seem frozen. Something may be aligning in God's wisdom while the believer is still too close to the process to recognize it. That possibility matters because it keeps waiting from becoming spiritually meaningless. And once a believer begins to accept that God may be doing hidden work even when nothing seems to change, a practical question rises with urgency. How do you keep speaking to Him in the middle of that process when your strength is running low? How do you approach God when the soul feels tired, the words feel few, and the heart is carrying more weight than it knows how to express? That is where the next chapter begins, because a silent season does not only require understanding, it requires a way of speaking to God that can survive exhaustion. How to speak to God when you are running out of strength. There are seasons when the hardest part of prayer is not deciding whether God is real. It is finding the strength to keep opening your mouth when your soul feels worn thin. The burden has lasted longer than expected. The silence has pressed on the heart for so long that even simple words can feel heavy. The mind is tired, the emotions are strained, and the spirit feels as though it has been carrying too much for too long. In that condition, many believers begin to feel guilty because prayer no longer sounds strong. They hear themselves and think the words are too small, too broken, too repetitive, too weak. But when strength is low, the goal of prayer is not to sound impressive. The goal is to stay turned toward God. That shift is critical because the enemy of a tired believer is not only despair, it is the false belief that weak prayer is worthless prayer. The truth is that some of the most honest prayers rise when a person has no strength left for polished language. In exhausting seasons, prayer often becomes simpler because the soul can no longer carry unnecessary weight. It stops trying to construct perfect sentences. It stops trying to manage spiritual appearance. It stops trying to sound like the person it used to be in easier times. Instead, it begins to speak from necessity. Help me. Hold me together. Do not let my heart harden. Give me grace for today. Show me how to stand. Stay near me while I walk through this. Those prayers may feel small to the one speaking them, but they are not small before God. They are direct. They are honest. They are born from dependence rather than performance. And in many seasons, that kind of prayer carries more truth than long, beautiful language ever could. This matters because tired believers often misunderstand what God requires from them. They imagine that the only prayers that count are the ones filled with energy, clarity, and spiritual force. But God is not measuring prayer by how eloquent it sounds. He sees the condition of the heart bringing it. He sees the effort it takes for an exhausted person to come to Him again. He sees the act of trust involved in kneeling down one more time after another day of silence. When strength is running low, simply returning to God's presence is already an act of faith. Speaking a few honest words from a weary soul is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is evidence that the relationship still matters enough for the believer to keep reaching upward. This is where the book of Psalms becomes especially precious, because it gives language to tired hearts that cannot always form their own. There are moments when the soul feels so burdened that original words do not come easily. In those times, borrowed language from Scripture can become a lifeline. David cried out from fear, confusion, sorrow, guilt, loneliness, and exhaustion. He did not wait for emotional order before praying. He brought disorder into prayer and let truth hold it there. That is a vital lesson. When your own language feels weak, you do not have to abandon prayer. You can enter prayer through the words God has already given. You can say, Lord, hear my cry. You can say, why are you cast down, O my soul? You can say, be merciful to me. You can say, I wait for the Lord. These are not borrowed phrases used to hide the heart. They are scriptural pathways that help the heart remain in conversation with God when personal words are hard to find. Another important lesson in weak seasons is that prayer does not need to be long to be real. Many believers carry unnecessary pressure because they compare their current weakness with earlier seasons when they had more emotional stamina. They remember times of longer prayer, deeper focus, stronger language, greater freedom. Then they look at their present condition and feel ashamed that all they can manage now is a few minutes of honest surrender. But God is not offended by brevity when brevity is all the strength you have. A short prayer offered truthfully is better than a long prayer sustained by strain and fear of not doing enough. In seasons of exhaustion, faithfulness may look like smaller, steadier acts of turning toward God instead of dramatic spiritual effort. That does not make the prayer life smaller in value. It makes it more closely matched to real dependence. There is also wisdom in learning to stop hiding your exhaustion from God. Many believers continue describing the situation while never fully describing their condition. They talk to God about the burden, but not about what the burden is doing to them. They speak about the unanswered prayer, but not about how tired they feel carrying it. They ask for change, but do not always confess how close they are to discouragement, numbness, or inner collapse. Yet this is exactly what must be brought into prayer. God does not only want to hear the request, He also invites the truth about the soul holding the request. Tell Him you are tired. Tell Him you are afraid of losing hope. Tell Him the silence has become hard to bear. Tell Him you do not want your heart to grow cold. This is not disrespect. It is relationship. Honest prayer does not reduce reverence. It deepens it by refusing falsehood in the presence of God. Jesus Himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, shows believers that honest anguish belongs in prayer. He was not casual about suffering. He was not emotionally untouched by what lay ahead. He brought the full weight of His agony before the Father with complete honesty and complete surrender. That example matters because it destroys the idea that real prayer must always sound calm and composed. There are moments when prayer is full of pressure, tears, struggle, and repeated surrender. What makes it holy is not the absence of anguish. It is the presence of trust within the anguish. That is what a tired believer must remember. Running out of strength does not mean you are disqualified from deep prayer. It may mean you are being invited into one of its most honest forms. And when a person learns to pray that way, without pretending strength that is no longer there, the soul begins to recover a different kind of hope. Not a loud hope built on emotional momentum, but a quieter and more durable hope built on continued nearness to God. That is where the final turn of this message begins, because silence does not deserve the final word over the life of a believer. The last chapter must answer the deepest fear of all, the fear that this season will define the whole story. Do not let silence write the final chapter. There is a reason silent seasons feel so dangerous. It is not only because they hurt, it is because they tempt you to believe that what you are living now is the whole story. When prayer has been heavy for a long time, when answers have been delayed, when the heart has fought to stay open and still feels the weight of heaven's silence, a subtle fear begins to grow. The fear is not only that this season is painful. The fear is that this season is permanent. The fear is that the silence has already said everything it is going to say. The fear is that the closed feeling you have carried before God will become the final atmosphere of your spiritual life. That is the lie this last chapter must confront directly. Silence is a season. It is not a verdict. Delay is real, but delay is not destiny. The quietness of this hour does not have the authority to define the ending of a life held in the hands of God. This is where many believers must make one of the most important decisions of their walk with God. They must decide that they will not allow an unfinished season to become a finished conclusion in their heart. That decision is not emotional denial. It is not pretending the pain is smaller than it is. It is not forcing false positivity onto real spiritual exhaustion. It is the deeply serious refusal to hand the pen of interpretation over to pain. It is the choice to say, I may not understand this chapter, but I will not call it the ending. I may not see movement yet, but I will not let stillness become prophecy. I may feel the weight of silence, but I will not crown silence as the final voice over my life. That refusal matters because what you believe in silence shapes how you continue. If you treat this season like the end, your heart will begin shutting down to protect itself. Prayer will become smaller, trust will become thinner, and expectation will quietly die behind spiritual language. But if you hold your place before God and refuse to let the silence define His character or your future, something powerful begins to happen. Hope starts changing form. It may no longer feel loud, but it becomes more rooted. It may no longer look dramatic, but it becomes more resilient. It becomes the kind of hope that is not dependent on immediate emotional reward. It becomes the kind of hope that survives because it has learned to attach itself to who God is, not merely to what the current season feels like. Scripture does not present God's people as strangers to unfinished chapters. Again and again, the middle of the story looked dark, confusing, delayed, and vulnerable to wrong interpretation. Joseph had years that made no visible sense if judged only by the moment. David was anointed long before he was established. Hannah carried anguish before she carried fulfillment. The disciples walked through the shock of the cross before they understood the power of the resurrection. In every one of those moments, if someone had declared the silent or painful chapter to be the final one, they would have spoken a lie over the story. That is the danger in your own life as well. You are too close to the process to name the ending by what you see right now. The chapter may be heavy, but God has not surrendered authorship. And this is where the believer must recover spiritual perspective. The silence has not made God less faithful. The waiting has not made Him less wise. The delay has not weakened His ability to act. What feels still to you is not still to Him in the same way. He sees the chapter and the ending together. He sees what is being formed in you, what is being restrained from you, what is being prepared around you, and what timing must accomplish before certain doors open. That does not remove the pain of waiting, but it does protect the heart from despair. Because despair says the silence means there is no future here. Faith says, I do not understand this season, but I know God is not finished because His character has not changed. So do not let silence write the final chapter. Do not let a closed feeling become a closed conclusion. Do not let exhaustion become prophecy. Do not let today's unanswered prayer convince you that tomorrow carries no mercy. The God who seems quiet is still the God who sees, still the God who keeps, still the God who forms, still the God who responds in wisdom deeper than your current understanding. Your task in this season is not to control the outcome. It is to remain near, to keep your heart from surrendering to false conclusions, to keep bringing God what is true, even when all you have are weak words and weary hands. To refuse the temptation to bury hope before God has spoken the last word. Because the greatest victory in some seasons is not that the answer came quickly. It is that you did not let the silence separate you from God. It is that your prayer life, though stripped down and wounded, remained alive. It is that your heart did not become permanently hard. It is that your trust, though tested, was not destroyed. It is that what almost buried your hope became the place where your faith was purified, steadied, and made more real than before. There is glory in that kind of endurance. There is beauty in a believer who stayed. Not because staying felt easy, but because leaving would have meant letting pain define God. So if heaven feels closed right now, hear this clearly. Keep praying. Keep coming back. Keep speaking truth over the lies that silence tries to plant. Keep refusing to make permanent conclusions in a temporary season. God has not lost sight of you. He has not become indifferent to your tears. He has not abandoned the work of his hands. This chapter is heavy, but it is not the end. And one day, whether through visible answer, deeper strength, holy clarity, or a peace that silence could not kill, you will understand that heaven was not absent while you were waiting. God was writing something deeper than you could see.